I divided this discussion, really as I did last week too, into two recordings instead of just the one, so that it's not real long. And I'm going to try to do that throughout the class, if in case it, because I know it's hard to sit here and especially listen to me for more than 5-6 minutes at a time. But no, just to sit and listen to any recording I know can be difficult. So first, I want to talk about restorative justice practices, really before that we get into the theory. The topic of restorative justice has been surrounded by considerable ambiguity. In fact, whenever I have this topic come up in class, it's interesting to hear what students say. Is it a concept? Is it a theory? Is it a social movement? Is it a program? Is it moving backward? Is it fundamentally misguided? Or is it really the wave of the future? Is it offering transformation and immense promise for a broken criminal justice system? I think it actually offers great promise, and additionally, it feels really morally appropriate, especially when we're talking about juveniles. According to Cohen, work on restorative justice grew out of a deep dissatisfaction with the traditional criminal justice system in developing societies. And remember, too, that restorative justice principles have been around for a long, long time, for hundreds of years. Traditional criminal justice with attorneys, judges, and juries grew out of a community and tribal justice. Restorative justice is a way to put justice back in to the hands of the community where it began, and the victim in such a manner that the offender is reintegrated into the community. In English law, the essays of Clarendon was established because accusers would often fail to show up for court, and this meant that the guilty person would go free, but also, and perhaps just as important, the king could not collect his fee. Thus, charging the suspect was really taken out of the hands of the victim and put into the hands of civic-minded citizens. Hundreds of years ago, with restorative justice, it began as I said, with the community really seeking reformation from the offender. So, for instance, if someone stole a sheep, then the person that stole would have to return with 2 sheep, and as it accumulates. But as we say, is if the offender doesn't pay the restitution, then it fell to the courts, it fell to the government, the jurisdiction. So now, instead of the crime being against the individual, they were against the state, or really rather the king. Offenses went from individual and private wrongdoings to public problems, in part to fill the king's coffers. Before this, the Romans had the Code of Hammurabi, and that was meant to protect the weak and the poor. And this is that over time, the simple connection between victim and offender really began to be displaced by further abstractions of legal jargon, and the state was the victim now. They replaced the victim in the restitution. And so this is what we have now within our traditional criminal justice system. In our system, it is the accused individual that is now against the state. So the focus in our traditional criminal justice system is on the offender and whether or not a crime was committed, and then whether this person was guilty or innocent. The defense tries to get the defendant off with as little negative consequences as possible, as little punishment as possible, and the prosecution pushes for more guilt and punishment. The actual victim's needs and rights are no longer central to the process, and the interpersonal dimensions of crime and harm have now become almost irrelevant. Our current system has now led to higher rates of recidivism, overcrowded prisons, an enormous amount of money that's being spent just to incarcerate people, So obviously our criminal justice has many problems. As we've covered in the earlier units in the class, our current system is based on deterrent theory, whereas restorative justice is really based on the harm caused and then how to put things right, how to restore that harm. It is in this context of a troubled system that a variety of ancient practices have been rediscovered and are now being adapted to more current times. And this is replacing the retributive justice and really sometimes actually supplementing it. These ancient practices focus on three main social actors in injustice, and this is the offenders, the victims, and the communities, and then as well as those relationships among those. If offenders are going to be released from prison, they need to do so in a way that makes them less likely to reoffend. And whenever we put an individual in prison, especially juveniles, their risk at reoffense increases. If victims are to survive the physical, emotional, and economical harm that they've suffered, they need to be recognized, heard, and responded to. So they need to be the focus. Finally, if communities are to be safer following offenses, then they need to devise practices that can respond to the harms done, as well as reintegrate offenders and victims that are involved directly in the harm, in the crime, in the behavior. We're going to cover the rest of this part and the next part. We're going to talk about restorative justice as programs and practices, and then we're really going to talk about the theory that's behind these programs and practices. So before we move into those definitions, let's talk a little bit about the important people that are involved in the restorative justice movement. First is Nels Christie. He writes about the dangers of the state taking over our anger, our need to punish, and to find retribution. This is a consequence of the state replacing the victim of the offense. Christie suggests that we, as citizens, that we should give up our power when we give our anger we give up our power when we give our anger to the state to deal with this conflict. Some of you might actually agree that our culture does not have many good psychological health or ways of dealing with anger, so it makes sense that we'd like to be rid of it. In addition, according to Christie, the community at large has lost the opportunity for norm clarification by turning over anger to the state. So this goes back to Durkheim's theory that crime sets a boundary for society in terms of what is acceptable and what is not. So the next scholar to talk about is John Braithwaite, and he is the first academic to write about restorative justice. He holds that societies where shame is an aspect of social control, they will have lower crime rates. He also uses Japan as an example. He suggests that there are two types of shaming, and that is reintegrative and stigmatizing. Reintegrative shaming is shaming or guilting the act or crime while acknowledging that the offender is part of the whole community. The act is bad, the person is not. So within reintegrative shaming, it usually involves what we're going to talk about more with processes of the circles, where all of those involved with the offender, including family, the offender. Those involved with the offender, the family, the community, they all come together and they tell the offender how they feel about their behavior and what it's done to them. And that's a way of shaming them, making them accountable. That's what's called this reintegrative shaming. Now, according to Braithwaite, our current justice system uses more of the stigmatizing shame. So the person is shamed rather than their behavior. They're a bad person because look what they did. This idea goes back to Edwin Lamont's labeling theory. The idea is that if we continually label a person, whether it's good or bad, they will eventually grow into that label. And so their behavior will now live up to the label that we have put upon them. For instance, if we tell a child that they're a troublemaker often enough, they will eventually believe that they are and begin to act like a troublemaker. So Lamert argues that by using words like felon, criminal, inmate, delinquent, that we're addressing who the person is rather than what the person does. So it is this core identity of who the person is that is formed by labeling and is very difficult to change. So behavior actually can be more easily changed than the label that we put on someone, or that is formed by the label, is what I mean. It's just as an example is if you tell somebody that they're a good person, they're doing well, especially children, you reward them with your words and your positive, reinforcement, that they will become that person. So central to Braithwaite's restorative justice is the importance of direct contact that's between the offenders and victims in a safe community of others. Others can be family, friends of both the offender and the victim, as well as members of the community that are interested in increasing the community awareness, that's interested in building a healthy community where all the people within that community are valued. And so the last pioneer I want to talk about is Howard Zehr. And he's accredited with bringing restorative justice into modern times. He wrote Changing Lenses. Now, this is a necessary read for anyone that's really interested in restorative justice. Dr. Thrush has taught restorative justice before, and I'm 100% sure that she used Changing Lenses. And I teach restorative justice classes as well, and I use that book as well. That's one of the central focuses of study within restorative justice. And basically, according to Zehr, restorative justice is, quote, a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address the harms, needs, and obligations. Here's what's important, in order to heal and put things as right as possible, end quote. The key elements of restorative justice, according to him, are the needs of the victims, the needs of the offender, and the needs of the community. What's important here that I want you to remember when thinking about restorative justice, we are putting things as right as possible. We're trying to restore back to the original state as much as as can be. Okay, now we're going to talk about the needs of the victim and the needs of the offender. So first, to start off with the needs of the victim. They include information, truth-telling, empowerment, and restitution or / vindication. Information. This is the victim needs answers to questions about the offense. Why it happened. What has happened since. They need to hear real information, not just speculation or the legally constrained information that comes from the trial or plea agreement. This really requires direct or indirect access to the offender. Next, according to Zehr, the victim needs truth-telling. This is where the victim needs to be able to tell their story of what happened, and they may need to tell it over and over. So part of the trauma of crime is that it upsets our view of what we see as the world. It upsets our life stories and ourselves. So it's very important for the victim to help the offender understand the impact of their actions. The next one is empowerment. Victims often feel like control has been taken away from them. They've lost control of their property, their bodies, their emotions, their dreams. So being involved in the justice process can be one way of returning a sense of empowerment. And this also has to do with the information. They need to be informed of what's going on in the process, what the status is, and any changes or updates. The last one, restitution or vindication. This is often important because of the actual losses, but just as important is the symbolic recognition that restitution implies. So when an offender makes an effort to make amends for the harm, or even if only partially, it's a way of them saying to the victim, I'm taking responsibility. You are not to blame. Now let's talk about what the offender needs. They need accountability that addresses the resulting harms. It encourages empathy and responsibility. and transfers the shame from the victim to them. Encouragement to experience personal transformation that can include a healing for the harms that contributed to their offending behavior, opportunities for treatment for addictions and other problems, enhancement of personal competencies. They need encouragement and support for reintegration into the community, or even integration into the community. And for some, at least, they need temporary restraint, and just depending on the level of their offending. There may be some formal punishment involved. The needs of the community now include, let's move to this, attention to their concerns as a victim, the opportunities to build a sense of community and mutual accountability, the encouragement to take on their obligations for the welfare of their members, including the victims and offenders, and they need to foster the conditions within the community that are now going to promote a more healthy environment, a more healthy community for everyone to restore the harm and come back to the prior state as much as possible. Okay, I'm going to stop here for this discussion and move into another recording where we'll begin with really summarizing the basic principles of restorative justice.